October 25, 1944. USS Lexington, 180 miles east of Luzon, Philippines. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Ogawa's world had shrunk to a life raft bobbing in the Pacific's endless blue. 3 hours earlier, his Zero had tumbled from the sky, engine seized, fuel tanks empty, shot full of holes by a Hellcat he never saw coming. Now, as the gray hull of an American aircraft carrier towered above him, blocking out the tropical sun, he prepared himself for death with the dignity expected of an Imperial Japanese Navy pilot. The Americans hauled him aboard with surprising gentleness. No beatings, no immediate execution, just firm hands guiding him up rope ladders, corpsmen checking him for injuries, removing his soaked flight suit. They wrapped him in a blanket that smelled clean, impossibly clean, and led him through a hatchway into the carrier's interior. That's when Kiyoshi Ogawa's understanding of the war, of America, of Japan's chances, of everything he'd been told since Pearl Harbor, began to collapse. The corridor wasn't just functional. It was spotless, bright. The overhead lighting didn't flicker like the weak bulbs aboard Japanese vessels, rationed and replaced only when they burned out completely. Here, every light blazed with casual abundance. The air smelled wrong too, not of machine oil and unwashed bodies and the stale rice that permeated every Japanese warship, but of something he couldn't immediately identify. Something sweet, something cooking. His guards walked him past a hatchway, and through it, Ogawa glimpsed something that made him stumble, certain his oxygen-deprived brain was manufacturing hallucinations. Rows of American sailors sat at tables with actual trays of food, not the thin gruel and pickled radish that constituted dinner aboard his carrier. Not the rice balls that had shrunk month by month as supply lines stretched and snapped. Real food, meat, vegetables, bread. And they were laughing, talking casually. Some were reading magazines while they ate, as if dining aboard a warship in a combat zone was no more remarkable than lunch at a Tokyo cafe before the war. One sailor walked past carrying something in a bowl, and Ogawa's mind simply refused to process what his eyes reported. Ice cream. A generous scoop of it. Creamy white. Already beginning to melt in the tropical heat, but still recognizably frozen. Impossibly cold. Impossibly indulgent. The sailor ate it with a spoon while walking, talking to a companion, treating this miracle as ordinary as air. Lieutenant Ogawa had not tasted fresh fruit in 8 months. His last real meal had been 2 days ago, a half portion of rice with dried fish. Yesterday, nothing. This morning, a handful of rice and weak tea before his final mission. The Americans who shot him down probably had bacon and eggs for breakfast, maybe pancakes. Definitely coffee with real sugar. The guard noticed him staring and said something in English, his tone almost apologetic. Another sailor appeared with a tray, for him, for the prisoner, for the enemy pilot who minutes ago had been trying to kill these very men. On the tray sat a sandwich thick with meat and cheese, an apple that shined red and perfect, a bottle of Coca-Cola beaded with condensation, and a small bowl of vanilla ice cream already softening at the edges. Kiyoshi Ogawa stared at this offering and felt something crack inside his chest. Not gratitude, not relief, something far worse. The terrible, crushing realization that Japan had already lost this war. Not lost a battle or a campaign. Lost everything. Because a nation that could afford to give ice cream to prisoners, to literally manufacture frozen desserts on warships in the tropics, and hand them to captured enemies without a second thought, that nation possessed resources so vast, so incomprehensible, that victory against it had never been possible. He had been told America was weak, soft, decadent, that Japanese spirit and discipline would overcome American materialism, that the samurai code would triumph over merchants and factory workers. Every meal aboard this carrier, every light burning bright, every clean uniform and well-fed sailor would prove those teachings to be lies. Dangerous, fatal lies that had sent hundreds of thousands of Japanese men to die fighting an enemy that could afford to be generous to its prisoners because it had already won. The ice cream melted, forgotten, as Ogawa contemplated the implications of a nation at war that still had the industrial capacity to manufacture luxuries. Japan's greatest warship, the Yamato, was running on fuel rationed so strictly that it couldn't leave port except for critical missions. American carriers were making ice cream. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy fielded what many historians consider the most elite naval aviation force ever assembled to that point in history. These weren't merely good pilots. They were the product of a selection and training system so rigorous that only 1 in 10 candidates survived to earn their wings. The average Japanese carrier pilot in late 1941 had accumulated over 800 flight hours, with many veterans of the China campaigns logging well over 1,000 hours in combat conditions. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, whose memoir would later provide Western audiences with intimate details of Japanese aviation culture, entered the war with more than 500 hours in the Zero alone. By comparison, the average American naval aviator at Pearl Harbor had roughly 300 flight hours, much of it in trainers. Japanese pilots flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that represented the pinnacle of design philosophy prioritizing performance over protection. With a maximum speed of 331 mph at 14,130 feet, a climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute, and a combat radius exceeding 1,100 miles with drop tanks, the Zero could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange every fighter the Allies could field in the Pacific in 1941. Its 20mm cannon and two 7mm machine guns gave it firepower that American F-4F Wildcats couldn't match. But the Zero's performance came with a cost invisible to pilots like Lieutenant Ogawa when they first climbed into its cockpit. No armor plating protected the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. No redundant systems offered backup if primary components failed. The Zero achieved its remarkable capabilities by eliminating weight wherever possible, including weight that might keep pilots alive. This design philosophy reflected not just engineering choices, but fundamental assumptions about warfare, that superior skill and aggression made defensive measures unnecessary, that the samurai spirit conquered material concerns. These assumptions extended beyond aircraft design into every aspect of Japanese naval aviation. Pilots received no training in ditching procedures or water survival because such instruction implied acceptance of failure. Parachutes were viewed with suspicion. The Code of Bushido, adapted for modern warfare, emphasized that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. Survival was secondary. The Japanese carriers that launched these elite pilots reflected similar priorities. Ships like Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, and Zuikaku were engineering marvels, carrying aircraft complements comparable to their American counterparts while achieving speeds exceeding 34 knots. But their internal spaces prioritized combat capability over crew comfort. Berthing areas were cramped. Meals were simple. Rice, fish, pickled vegetables, tea. Fresh provisions were consumed within days of leaving port. After that, the menu shifted to preserved foods, dried goods, and progressively smaller portions as missions extended. This wasn't unusual for Japanese forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy fed its sailors approximately 3,000 calories per day in port, dropping to 2,500 or less at sea as fresh provisions depleted. Submarine crews often subsisted on as little as 2,000 calories daily on extended patrols. By 1943, as supply lines stretched and snapped under American submarine attacks, even these meager rations became aspirational goals rather than guaranteed minimums. Yet in December 1941, none of this mattered. Japanese pilots had crushed American, British, and Dutch forces across the Pacific. They had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse. They had destroyed hundreds of American aircraft on the ground and in the air. They had established air superiority from Burma to the Solomons. Their aircraft were superior. Their training was superior. Their spirit was unbreakable. What they ate for dinner seemed irrelevant next to these fundamental truths. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who would survive the war to co-author a detailed account of Japanese naval aviation, summarized the prevailing attitude in those early months. We believed absolutely in our superiority as pilots and in the superiority of our equipment, he would later write. American pilots seemed poorly trained, their tactics unimaginative, their aircraft inferior. We had every reason for confidence. That confidence wasn't baseless arrogance. It was earned through victory after victory, through kill ratios that consistently favored Japanese pilots, through the demonstrable superiority of aircraft and training. When Japanese pilots looked at early war American opposition, they saw confirmation of everything they'd been taught, that Japanese discipline and skill would overcome American industrial might, that quality would defeat quantity, that the samurai spirit remained supreme, even in the age of the aircraft carrier. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see from their cramped quarters and simple meals and magnificent but fragile aircraft, was the vast industrial infrastructure beginning to accelerate in American shipyards, aircraft factories, and training bases. They didn't see the Liberty ships being launched faster than submarines could sink them. They didn't see the aircraft rolling off production lines in numbers that would soon make Japanese production look like a cottage industry. They didn't see the training programs that would transform American aviation from outmatched to overwhelming in less than 2 years. And they certainly didn't see the ice cream machines being installed on American carriers, powered by generators so abundant that frozen desserts represented a trivial drain on available electrical capacity. While Japanese pilots trained in Spartan conditions and flew from carriers where fresh food was a memory within days of departure, American naval aviation was being built on a foundation of industrial abundance that Japanese planners either didn't comprehend or actively dismissed as evidence of weakness. The numbers tell a story of two completely different approaches to naval warfare. By 1943, the United States Navy operated more than 50,000 refrigeration units across its fleet. Not cooling systems for ammunition, or fuel or equipment. Refrigeration specifically for food. These units consumed roughly 240 million kilowatt-hours annually, enough electricity to power a city of 50,000 people. The Essex-class carriers entering service in 1943 each carried refrigeration capacity exceeding 2,000 cubic feet, capable of storing 500,000 pounds of frozen provisions and 100,000 pounds of refrigerated fresh food. Each Essex-class carrier housed multiple galleys capable of preparing 12,000 meals daily. Menus rotated on a 21-day cycle to prevent monotony. Breakfast options included eggs prepared to order, bacon, sausage, pancakes, toast, fresh fruit, coffee, milk, and fruit juice. Lunch and dinner featured multiple entree choices, fresh vegetables, bread, desserts, and beverages. Ships carried ice cream machines capable of producing 10 gallons per hour, enough to serve the entire crew several times weekly. The USS Lexington, the carrier that would pick up Lieutenant Ogawa, carried provisions including 45,000 pounds of flour, 18,000 pounds of sugar, 9,000 pounds of coffee, 12,000 pounds of butter, and 500 gallons of ice cream mix. Its bakery produced 1,500 loaves of bread daily. Its butcher shop processed beef, pork, and chicken, delivered frozen and stored at precise temperatures until needed. The ship's stores included multiple varieties of fresh fruit rotated to prevent spoilage. This wasn't luxury. This was standard operating procedure across the U.S. Navy. Destroyers had ice cream machines. Submarines served fresh-baked bread. Even PT boats carried Coca-Cola when possible. The reasoning was pragmatic rather than indulgent. Well-fed sailors worked harder, fought better, and maintained morale during extended combat operations. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a weapon system. The industrial capacity required to support this level of provisioning was staggering. The U.S. produced 44% of the world's food during World War II, while feeding not just its own military, but also supplying allies through Lend-Lease. American farms operated with mechanization levels unimaginable in Japan. One American farmer, using a tractor and modern equipment, could produce as much as 25 Japanese farmers using traditional methods. This agricultural abundance freed industrial workers and soldiers, while ensuring military forces never went hungry. Refrigerated cargo ships transported frozen meat, vegetables, and dairy products across the Pacific. By 1944, the Navy operated dedicated storeships carrying nothing but food, spare parts, and supplies, essentially floating warehouses that could replenish carriers and battleships at sea. These logistics ships were themselves larger than many Japanese warships, crewed by hundreds of sailors whose sole purpose was maintaining the American military's supply chain. The contrast with Japanese logistics couldn't have been starker. Japan entered the war with limited refrigeration capacity on combat vessels. Most food storage was dry or preserved. Fresh provisions loaded in port, fish, rice, vegetables, spoiled quickly in tropical heat. Within a week at sea, Japanese sailors transitioned to preserved foods, dried fish, pickled vegetables, rice, and tea. As the war progressed and shipping losses mounted, even these basics became scarce. Japanese carriers carried perhaps 1/10 the refrigeration capacity of American counterparts. The concept of ice cream machines aboard warships would have seemed not just extravagant, but insane. A waste of electrical capacity, storage space, and resources better devoted to ammunition or fuel. Japanese naval planners allocated food based on minimum caloric requirements, not morale considerations. survival rations, not enjoyment. By 1943, Japanese submarines, which should have been attacking American supply lines, were instead being used to transport rice and supplies to bypassed island garrisons because surface shipping had become too vulnerable. Submarines that could have been sinking American carriers were running groceries to Rabaul. This wasn't incompetence. It was desperation. The American approach to feeding its forces reflected deeper assumptions about industrial warfare. America wasn't fighting a war of scarcity, rationing every resource to maximize combat effectiveness. America was fighting a war of abundance, producing so much of everything that questions like, can we afford ice cream machines on carriers, never needed asking. The answer was always yes, because the cost, in money, industrial capacity, shipping space, was trivial relative to total production. Consider the electricity required to power those ice cream machines. A typical unit consumed roughly 5 kilowatts operating continuously. Across a carrier's crew of 3,000, serving ice cream twice weekly required perhaps 100 kilowatt hours monthly. The carrier's total electrical generation capacity exceeded 10,000 kilowatts. Ice cream represented 0.1% of available power, less than a rounding error. But that calculation assumed American carriers ran near maximum capacity, rationing electricity carefully. They didn't. Most operated at perhaps 60 to 70% of generating capacity under normal conditions, leaving vast reserves for damage control, increased operations, or simply the casual abundance that characterized American logistics. Lights burned bright throughout the ship because they could. Sailors enjoyed hot showers because freshwater production exceeded needs. Washing machines cleaned uniforms daily because the electricity and water were available. This abundance extended beyond food and comfort. American carriers stocked spare parts in quantities Japanese logistics officers would have considered criminally wasteful. If an aircraft engine failed, mechanics simply replaced it, often discarding repairable engines because new ones were more readily available than repair time. Japanese mechanics nursed failing engines through multiple missions, replaced worn parts with handcrafted substitutes, and kept aircraft flying through miracles of improvisation because replacement engines weren't coming. The USS Enterprise carried enough spare parts to rebuild approximately 40% of its aircraft complement from scratch. Its machine shops could manufacture replacement parts using raw stock, carried specifically for this purpose. When an F-6F Hellcat returned with battle damage, crew could often rebuild it overnight using spare parts pulled from organized storage. The carrier was essentially a floating aircraft factory, capable of maintenance operations that would require a major base facility in the Japanese Navy. American pilots understood their equipment was expendable in ways Japanese pilots couldn't imagine. If an aircraft developed mechanical problems, the pilot landed, got a different plane, and flew again. The problematic aircraft went to maintenance, where mechanics either fixed it or cannibalized it for parts without significant concern about wasting resources. Production was replacing aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. This disposable mentality shocked Japanese prisoners. They came from a military culture where a rifle was a sacred object, cleaned daily, maintained obsessively, treated with reverence. Japanese pilots knew their aircraft by serial number, developing personal relationships with specific planes. The idea of treating a Zero as disposable, replaceable, fundamentally interchangeable, would have seemed not just wasteful, but spiritually wrong. American pilots named their aircraft, but understood the names were transferred when planes were replaced. The aircraft wasn't special, the pilot was. If protecting the pilot required abandoning a damaged aircraft, that was an easy choice. The factory would build another plane. Training another pilot took 2 years. This fundamental difference in perspective, material abundance versus material scarcity, would shape every aspect of the Pacific Air War. Japanese pilots fought brilliantly with limited resources, maximizing every advantage their superior training and equipment provided. American pilots fought adequately with unlimited resources, absorbing losses that would have crippled Japanese squadrons and returning stronger through sheer industrial replacement capacity. The ice cream machines were symbolic of this larger reality. They weren't militarily necessary. They didn't make carriers float better or aircraft fly faster. But they represented an industrial base so vast, so productive, so capable of supporting warfare's material requirements while simultaneously maintaining quality of life, that victory was inevitable regardless of Japanese skill or courage. Lieutenant Ogawa didn't know these statistics when he was hauled aboard the Lexington. He didn't know that American food production exceeded consumption by such margins that throwing away leftovers was routine. He didn't know that the electricity powering his interrogation room's lights cost literally less than a penny per hour, so cheap that no one bothered calculating it. But he was about to learn, and the lesson would break him in ways combat never could. The initial encounters between Japanese pilots and American naval abundance occurred not in combat, but in the aftermath, in hospitals, on rescue ships, aboard the carriers that plucked downed airmen from the Pacific's waters. These first contacts provided glimpses of American logistics that Japanese pilots struggled to reconcile with their understanding of warfare. Petty Officer Takeo Tanamizu, shot down during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, spent 6 hours in a life raft before an American destroyer picked him up. His squadron had launched that morning on the war's 140th day. Breakfast had been rice and pickled radish, the same meal they'd eaten for 3 weeks. The destroyer's crew gave him chicken noodle soup, crackers, and coffee with sugar. Real sugar. White, refined, abundant. The sailor serving it offered seconds without hesitation. Tanamizu later told interrogators, "I thought it was special treatment because I was a prisoner who might provide intelligence. Then I saw the American sailors eating the same food. Better food, actually. They had meat, fresh bread. I couldn't understand. These men were at war. Their ship had just been in battle, but they ate like it was peacetime in a wealthy household." The Americans examining him were equally puzzled by his physical condition. At 5'6" and 127 pounds, Tanamizu wasn't emaciated by Japanese standards. He was normal for a naval aviator. But the American doctor who examined him documented signs of chronic malnutrition, particularly vitamin deficiencies consistent with limited fresh fruit and vegetable intake. The medical report noted with some alarm that this was a frontline combat pilot, presumably among Japan's best-fed forces. By contrast, American pilots of similar height averaged 150 to 160 pounds, and medical officers concerned themselves with preventing excessive weight gain from shipboard food abundance. The Essex-class carrier's exercise rooms weren't luxuries. They were necessities to keep sailors fit despite caloric intake that often exceeded 4,000 calories daily. Lieutenant Junior Grade Fujita Iyozo, pulled from the water after the Battle of Midway, provided more detailed observations. Wounded in the leg and shoulder, he spent 3 weeks in the Carrier Enterprise's sickbay before transfer to a hospital ship. His written account, captured after the war, described experiences that seemed designed to demonstrate American superiority. The medical facilities aboard their carrier exceeded those at our naval hospital in Yokosuka, he wrote. Clean beds with white sheets, changed daily. Meals served on trays with separate compartments for each food item. Meat at every meal, beef, pork, chicken. Fresh fruit daily, even bananas and oranges which must have been shipped from great distances. The portions were enormous. I could not finish the servings, yet they offered more without hesitation. But what disturbed me most was the casual waste. American sailors threw away food that would feed a Japanese sailor for 2 days. Half-eaten apples in trash bins. Entire portions of meat discarded because the sailor wasn't hungry. Bread crusts cut away and disposed of. I watched a cook throw away perhaps 20 pounds of rice because it had been sitting too long and wasn't fresh enough. 20 pounds of rice, enough to feed our entire squadron for 2 days, thrown away. I began to understand that we were not fighting an enemy. We were fighting an economy. These early prisoner accounts, compiled by Japanese intelligence services and distributed to senior officers, should have served as warnings. Instead, they were often dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. The prisoners had been brainwashed. The thinking went, or were lying to excuse their failure and capture. The accounts contradicted fundamental assumptions about American weakness and decadence. How could a nation so wasteful, so concerned with comfort and luxury, possibly sustain a serious war effort? Japanese military theory held that hardship forged strength, that deprivation built character, that suffering created better soldiers. American abundance seemed to prove they were soft, weak, unprepared for the harsh realities of total war. This misunderstanding persisted despite mounting evidence. After the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, several Japanese pilots observed American carrier operations during attack runs. Lieutenant Ayao Shirani reported, their flight deck crews worked with what seemed like casual efficiency. No sense of urgency or desperation. They handled aircraft and munitions as if resources were unlimited, pushing damaged planes overboard to clear the deck rather than attempting recovery. We would never waste an aircraft so carelessly. What Shirani interpreted as carelessness was actually calculated efficiency. American carriers could sacrifice a damaged aircraft to maintain operational tempo, because replacing one plane was trivial compared to maintaining deck readiness. The damaged aircraft pushed overboard was already being replaced by another rolling off a production line in Connecticut or California. Clearing the deck in 90 seconds rather than 15 minutes attempting recovery meant launching more strikes, faster. That speed advantage was worth a dozen aircraft. Japanese carriers couldn't afford such calculations. Every aircraft was precious, nearly irreplaceable. Recovery efforts often tied up deck crews for extended periods because losing the plane meant losing capability that couldn't be quickly restored. This created a spiral. Slower operations led to fewer strikes. Fewer strikes meant less effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness meant longer campaigns. Longer campaigns meant more attrition. More attrition meant even fewer aircraft. By late 1942, experienced Japanese pilots began noticing other indicators of American abundance. Downed American aviators often carried multiple forms of currency, survival gear that included fishing tackle and emergency rations, even small luxuries like cigarettes and chocolate. Japanese pilots carried minimal survival equipment because weight mattered and because rescue services were limited. If you went down in hostile territory, you probably died. Carrying extensive survival gear seemed pointless. American pilots knew rescue services, submarines, flying boats, destroyers, actively searched for downed aviators. Complex rescue procedures, specialized equipment, dedicated assets, all to recover one pilot. The calculations seemed insane to Japanese observers until they understood the underlying economics. Training a pilot cost approximately $100,000 and required 2 years. Dedicating a submarine and crew to pilot rescue cost perhaps $50,000 per mission. If the submarine recovered even one pilot, the mission was cost-effective. Usually they recovered multiple aviators. Japan couldn't afford such economics. Pilot training took similar time, but Japan couldn't spare submarines for rescue operations. Submarines were needed for commerce raiding, supply runs, combat patrols. Using valuable assets to rescue downed pilots seemed extravagant when those pilots could be replaced with new trainees. Except the new trainees weren't as good, and the experience level of Japanese naval aviation steadily declined while American pilot quality steadily improved. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces with 64 confirmed kills, described the growing realization among Japanese pilots. By 1943, we began to suspect the propaganda was lies. American pilots weren't poorly trained. Their aircraft weren't inferior. But more than their improving skills or better planes, it was their obvious health and morale that concerned us. They looked well-fed, well-rested, confident. We were growing thin, exhausted, increasingly desperate. They seemed to grow stronger. The food situation aboard Japanese carriers had deteriorated noticeably by mid-1943. Fresh provisions were memories. Rice portions had shrunk. Fish was often spoiled by the time it was served. Tea was weak, coffee non-existent. Pilots lost weight steadily, combat stress and inadequate nutrition combining to produce visible physical decline. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from debriefed prisoners described American carriers serving multiple hot meals daily, ice cream socials, even fresh-baked pies. Japanese intelligence officers struggled to reconcile these reports with their understanding of a nation supposedly stretched thin, fighting a two-front war. How could America afford to feed its sailors steak and ice cream while simultaneously shipping supplies to Britain, Russia, and China? The answer was industrial capacity, on a scale Japanese planners had failed to grasp. America wasn't choosing between feeding sailors well or supplying allies. It did both, easily, with capacity to spare. The Lend-Lease program shipped enough food to feed 20 million people for 4 years. The U.S. military consumed approximately 15% of American food production. There was no trade-off. There was just production. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Sadamu, senior intelligence officer aboard the carrier Shokaku, compiled a report in August 1943 attempting to quantify American logistics based on prisoner debriefings and captured documents. His findings were so contrary to accepted doctrine that he reportedly hesitated before submitting them. If prisoner accounts are accurate, and multiple independent sources confirm similar details, American naval logistics operate at levels exceeding our most optimistic pre-war estimates by factors of 5 to 10. They do not merely feed their sailors adequately. They feed them extravagantly. This suggests either prisoners are systematically lying in coordinated fashion, which seems unlikely given their various capture circumstances, or American industrial production exceeds our intelligence estimates by similar factors. If the latter is correct, we have gravely miscalculated our enemy's capacity to sustain prolonged warfare. Our strategy assumes American resolve will break under accumulating losses, but a nation that can afford ice cream machines on warships during total war may have resolve proportional to its industrial capacity. We may be fighting an enemy we cannot outlast. The report was filed and apparently ignored. Accepting its implications required abandoning fundamental assumptions about Japanese superiority and the war's inevitable outcome. Easier to believe the prisoners were lying, that American abundance was propaganda, that Japanese spirit would ultimately prevail over material advantage. But the pilots knew. The ones who flew against American forces day after day, watching enemy formations grow larger while their own squadrons shrank. The ones who saw American aircraft quality improve while their own Zeros grew older, maintenance more improvised, replacement parts more scarce. The ones whose breakfast portions got smaller each week while prisoners reported American sailors complaining about monotonous menus that rotated only every 3 weeks. The ice cream was real. The implications were catastrophic. Consider aircraft production. In 1941, Japan produced 5,088 aircraft of all types. The United States produced 19,433. Japanese planners knew this disparity, but believed superior quality and pilot training would compensate. They were partially right for about 6 months. By 1942, American production reached 47,136 aircraft, while Japan managed 8,861. The gap was widening, but Japanese forces still maintained tactical superiority through better pilots and aircraft like the Zero. Then came 1943. America built 85,998 aircraft. Japan built 16,693. The ratio had shifted from roughly 2 to 1 to more than 5 to 1. In 1944, American factories delivered 96,318 aircraft. Japan produced 28,180. But these raw numbers obscured even worse realities. Japanese production included thousands of obsolete or second-rate aircraft built, because modern designs required materials and manufacturing capacity Japan no longer possessed. American production was increasingly dominated by advanced types like the F-6F Hellcat, F-4U Corsair, and P-51 Mustang, aircraft that matched or exceeded Japanese performance while being built in quantities Japan couldn't approach. The 1944 production figures meant America was building more aircraft each day, 264 on average, than Japan built in a week. Every 3 weeks, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan's entire 1941 output. The numbers were so overwhelming that Japanese planners initially assumed they were American propaganda. Surely no nation could sustain such production rates. Surely the figures were exaggerated. They weren't. If anything, public reports understated American capacity because security concerns prevented full disclosure. The actual figures were worse from Japan's perspective, but aircraft were only part of the story. Naval construction told an even more devastating tale. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy was arguably the world's most powerful, with 10 carriers, 10 battleships, and extensive cruiser and destroyer forces. American naval construction was accelerating, but hadn't yet reached full mobilization. Japanese strategists believed they had a window of perhaps 2 years before American shipyards overcame the initial deficit. They were wrong by 18 months. By January 1943, American shipyards were launching escort carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The Essex-class fleet carriers, purpose-built combat vessels displacing 2,100 tons and carrying over 90 aircraft, were entering service every 6 to 8 weeks. Japan's entire war production managed 3 fleet carriers. The United States commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers during the war, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. But those numbers paled next to escort carrier production. The Casablanca-class escort carriers, smaller vessels intended for anti-submarine warfare, convoy protection, and amphibious support, entered service at a rate approaching 1 per week during peak production. 50 Casablanca-class ships were commissioned between July 1943 and July 1944. 50 carriers in 12 months. Japan built 3 fleet carriers during the entire war. The construction timeline was equally shocking. The USS Casablanca, lead ship of her class, was laid down on November 3, 1942, launched January 5, 1943, commissioned July 8, 1943, from keel laying to combat readiness in 8 months. Japanese carriers required 2 to 3 years to build, longer if you counted design time. American destroyers appeared even faster. The Fletcher-class destroyers that formed the backbone of the Pacific Fleet's screening forces were being built in dozens of shipyards simultaneously. Peak production saw commissioning rates exceeding 2 ships per week. By war's end, 175 Fletcher-class destroyers had entered service. Japan built 63 destroyers of all classes during the entire war, and lost most of them to American submarines, aircraft, and surface forces. The Liberty ship program achieved production rates that Japanese observers initially dismissed as impossible propaganda. Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels designed for rapid construction, emerged from American shipyards at peak rates of 3 per day. 3 ocean-going cargo ships daily. The Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, as a demonstration of construction efficiency. Even accounting for prefabricated components and incomplete fitting out, the speed was unprecedented. By war's end, 2,110 Liberty ships had been completed. Japan's entire merchant marine in 1941 totaled approximately 6 million tons. Liberty ships alone added 27 million tons to Allied shipping capacity, more than 4 times Japan's pre-war total, and built faster than submarines could sink them. The implications were staggering. Japanese submarines and aircraft had sunk 2,346 Allied merchant ships totaling 7 million tons during the war. American shipyards built back that tonnage plus an additional 15 million tons. For every ship Japan sank, American yards built more than 1 replacement. The maritime war of attrition was unwinnable. These production figures supported logistical capabilities that Japanese forces couldn't match. The ice cream machines aboard American carriers were powered by electrical generation capacity, exceeding 10,000 kilowatts per ship, more than many Japanese shore facilities. The refrigeration systems maintaining tons of frozen provisions consumed electricity casually because generation capacity was abundant. Steam plants powered by fuel oil delivered in quantities that made Japanese rationing look like starvation. Consider fuel consumption. The Essex-class carriers burned approximately 100,000 gallons of fuel oil daily under combat operations. That's over 9 million gallons monthly. One carrier consumed more fuel monthly than some Japanese naval bases received quarterly, and America was operating dozens of such ships simultaneously, supporting them with tankers that themselves consumed more fuel than Japanese carriers. The USS Lexington, the carrier where Lieutenant Ogawa discovered ice cream machines, was supported by a logistics train that included dedicated oilers delivering 500 plus gallons of fuel oil per replenishment, ammunition ships carrying 2 plus tons of bombs, torpedoes, and shells, store ships delivering 1 plus pounds of provisions every 30 days, freshwater production capacity of 200,000 gallons daily, laundry facilities processing 8,000 pounds of clothing daily, medical facilities exceeding many shore hospitals, machine shops capable of manufacturing most spare parts from raw stock, bakeries producing 500 loaves of bread daily, ice cream production capacity of 10 gallons per hour. This single ship, one of many, consumed resources daily that exceeded some Japanese bases' monthly allocation, and it wasn't straining to do so. This was normal operation, sustained indefinitely, with resources to spare. The food production figures alone were devastating to Japanese morale once prisoners learned them. The United States produced 44% of the world's total food output during World War II. American farms using mechanized equipment produced enough food to feed the entire American military, 12+ million personnel at peak, the entire American civilian population, 135+ million, substantial Lend-Lease shipments to Britain, Soviet Union, China, and other allies, and still maintain strategic reserves. Japan's agricultural production, even at war's start, was insufficient to feed its population without imports. By 1944, with shipping disrupted by American submarines, Japan faced growing food shortages. Civilians were rationed. Military forces received priority, but even military rations were declining. Meanwhile, American forces enjoyed meals that exceeded pre-war Japanese civilian standards. The mathematical comparisons were brutal. Steel production in 1944, United States 89. 6 million tons, Japan 4. 8 million tons, ratio 18. 7 to 1. Oil production in 1944, United States 4. 7 billion barrels, Japan 8. 4 million barrels, mostly from occupied territories, ratio 559 to 1. Aluminum production in 1944, United States 1,916 million pounds, Japan 141 million pounds, ratio 13. 6 to 1. Automotive production from 1941 to 1945 total, United States 3,000 military vehicles, Japan 165,000 military vehicles, ratio 18, 2 to 1. These weren't just numbers on paper. They translated directly to combat capability. More steel meant more ships, tanks, and aircraft. More oil meant more fuel for operations. More aluminum meant more aircraft. More vehicles meant better logistics. And better logistics meant well-fed, well-equipped, well-supplied forces that could sustain operations indefinitely. Japanese Lieutenant Tadashi Nakajima, captured at Okinawa and shown American production statistics during interrogation, summarized the reaction many prisoners experienced. I refused to believe the numbers initially. They seemed impossible. But then I calculated backwards from what I'd observed, the number of ships I'd seen, the aircraft formations, the abundant supplies, and the math worked. They weren't exaggerating. If anything, they were understating capacity because security prevented full disclosure. What destroyed me psychologically wasn't the combat defeat. It was understanding that we never had a chance. Not because we lacked courage or skill or will to fight. We lacked the industrial base to sustain modern warfare against an enemy that could outproduce us 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 in critical materials. We were fighting an economy, and you cannot defeat an economy with tactics. The ice cream represented this perfectly. Making ice cream aboard carriers required agricultural capacity to produce dairy, sugar, and flavorings, industrial capacity to manufacture ice cream machines, electrical capacity to power them, shipping capacity to deliver supplies, and abundance so vast that diverting resources to frozen dessert was trivial. Every scoop of ice cream served to American sailors represented industrial capacity we couldn't match. When I calculated the resources required to support just the ice cream program across the American fleet, hundreds of machines, thousands of tons of ice cream mix, electrical power consumption in the megawatts, shipping space for non-essential luxuries, the total exceeded Japan's production capacity for critical war materials. They were literally spending more on ice cream than we could afford to spend on aluminum for aircraft. That's when I understood we'd lost. Not when my plane was shot down, not when I was captured, but when I calculated that American ice cream production represented greater industrial capacity than Japanese aircraft production. The war was over. We just hadn't admitted it yet. By late 1944, even Japanese propaganda couldn't hide the production disparity. Newspaper articles that once boasted of Japanese industrial might fell silent. Radio broadcasts stopped claiming parity with American manufacturing. The official line shifted from "we will outproduce them" to "our spirit will overcome their materialism" to, eventually, silence. The math was irrefutable. The implications were devastating. And the ice cream kept coming, 3 times weekly, different flavors, served to sailors who expected such luxuries as normal even while fighting a global war. Because America could afford it. Because production exceeded consumption by margins so vast that luxuries cost nothing. Because defeating Japan was economically easy, even while simultaneously fighting Germany. The Samurai Code valued honor over survival. American industrial production made survival easy enough that honor became affordable. And that difference, between a military culture that demanded sacrifice and an industrial base that made sacrifice unnecessary, explained the Pacific War's outcome more completely than any tactical analysis ever could. By spring 1945, the contrast between Japanese desperation and American abundance had become so stark that even the most dedicated Japanese personnel couldn't maintain psychological denial. The evidence was everywhere, overwhelming, irrefutable. Japan was starving. America was serving ice cream. The kamikaze program, initiated in October 1944, represented Japan's ultimate admission that conventional warfare had failed. When you're sending pilots on suicide missions because you lack fuel for return trips, when you're crashing aircraft into ships because you can't afford to miss, when you're framing military necessity as spiritual transcendence, you've already lost the material war. American sailors watching kamikazes strike their ships couldn't know the full desperation driving those attacks. Yes, Japanese pilots were brave. Yes, they believed in their cause. but they were also often flying on partial fuel loads because Japan couldn't afford full tanks for one-way missions. They were piloting obsolete aircraft because modern fighters required materials Japan no longer possessed. They were dying not just for honor, but because their military had run out of alternatives. Meanwhile, American carriers struck by kamikazes absorbed damage that would have sunk Japanese vessels. Damage control parties trained extensively, equipped abundantly, fought fires with water pressure Japanese ships couldn't match, sealed breaches with materials Japanese damage control couldn't access, and saved ships that by Japanese standards were already lost. Then those damaged carriers sailed to repair facilities, often floating dry docks brought forward specifically for this purpose, where they were restored to combat readiness in weeks rather than months. The contrast was visible even to sailors who never set foot on enemy vessels. Petty Officer Sakamoto Hideo, serving aboard the destroyer Yahagi during Operation Tengo, the final suicide sortie of battleship Yamato in April 1945, described the mission's preparations. "We knew it was one way. Yamato had enough fuel for the journey to Okinawa, but not the return. We had maybe 60% fuel capacity. The entire task force was running on fumes, literally. Our orders were to beach Yamato at Okinawa and use it as an artillery battery until destroyed. No pretense of survival, no plan for retreat, just death, formalized and ordered. What struck me wasn't fear. We'd accepted death already. What struck me was the absurdity. We were sending Japan's greatest battleship, a vessel that cost unimaginable resources to build, on a suicide mission because we lacked the fuel to use it properly. The ship displaced 72,000 tons. We couldn't afford 6,000 tons of fuel oil to fill its tanks. Meanwhile, American carriers were operating continuously, launching strikes, recovering aircraft, conducting operations that consumed fuel at rates exceeding our monthly production. They had fuel to spare. We had enough for one final voyage. The food situation was equally stark. Our final meal before sailing was rice and pickled radish. No fish, no vegetables, just rice. And the rice portions were smaller than normal because supplies were limited. We were sailing to die on empty stomachs because Japan couldn't afford to feed sailors properly even for suicide missions. When American aircraft found us, and they found us within hours because their reconnaissance was that good, the attack was overwhelming. Hundreds of aircraft, wave after wave. They could afford to throw 400 planes at us because they had thousands more. We could barely scramble a combat air patrol because we'd already lost most of our aircraft to previous battles and couldn't replace them. Yamato took dozens of torpedoes and bombs before finally capsizing. I survived because I was on Yahagi, which sank earlier, and was picked up by an American destroyer. When they pulled me from the water, I was hypothermic, injured, and starving. They gave me heated blankets, medical treatment, and chicken soup. Chicken soup. I was the enemy. I'd been trying to kill them hours before, and they gave me chicken soup like it was normal. Like feeding prisoners well was routine. The destroyer's crew looked healthy, well-fed, confident. They'd just participated in destroying Japan's remaining naval power, and they treated it like a successful day's work, rather than a historic victory. Later, when I could speak, I asked the sailor guarding me why they fed prisoners so well. He looked confused by the question. "You're injured and cold," he said. "Hot soup helps." As if the answer was obvious. As if resources were so abundant that calculating the cost of feeding enemies was unnecessary. I learned later that the destroyer had refrigeration, a galley serving hot meals 3 times daily, coffee available constantly, and adequate medical supplies to treat both crew and prisoners. Our destroyer had barely enough rice for the crew, no refrigeration, and medical supplies exhausted months ago. We were fighting the same war in completely different material circumstances. Sakamoto's experience was repeated thousands of times as Japanese forces collapsed throughout 1945. Surrendered garrisons emerged from jungles emaciated, diseased, surviving on roots and insects. American forces feeding these prisoners were shocked by their physical condition, not understanding that this was normal for Japanese forces by war's end, that starvation was policy rather than exception. On Okinawa, Japanese defenders ate their horses, then bark, then finally grass, trying to sustain resistance. American forces, supplied by the vast logistics train supporting the invasion, ate hot meals, drank coffee, and received ice cream deliveries from support ships offshore. The contrast was so extreme that some American soldiers initially refused to believe Japanese prisoners were military personnel. Surely actual soldiers would be better fed. Lieutenant Yahara Hiromichi, Senior Operations Officer for Japanese forces on Okinawa, later wrote, "By May 1945, our forces were literally starving. We'd consumed all food stores. Resupply was impossible. American naval forces controlled surrounding waters completely. Our soldiers fought on will alone, because physical strength had long since depleted. When I surrendered in June, American soldiers gave me water, food, and medical attention immediately. The water alone seemed miraculous, clean, cold, abundant. We'd been drinking contaminated water from shell craters, watching men die from dysentery, unable to do anything because we lacked even basic medical supplies. Americans had water purification systems, medical facilities, abundant supplies of everything. They fed me rice, real rice, properly cooked, as much as I could eat. Then soup. Then gradually heavier foods. The doctor explained they were worried about refeeding syndrome, that starving people need careful dietary rehabilitation. The fact that they had protocols for treating starved prisoners, that this was routine enough to have medical procedures, revealed how thoroughly they understood our condition. But what devastated me psychologically was learning this was normal. Every American unit was well supplied. Every field hospital had adequate medicine. Every company had access to hot meals, clean water, and basic comforts. This wasn't special treatment for propaganda purposes. This was standard operating procedure. I'd spent years studying American military doctrine, analyzing their tactics, trying to find weaknesses. I'd focused entirely on combat capabilities and missed the obvious. Their greatest strength wasn't tactical sophistication or technological superiority. It was logistics. They could afford to fight carefully, patiently, thoroughly, because they had resources to sustain any operation indefinitely. We had to fight desperately, aggressively, recklessly, because we were running out of everything. By July 1945, Japan's home islands faced starvation. The submarine blockade had reduced food imports to negligible levels. The 1945 rice harvest was failing due to fertilizer shortages. Civilians were surviving on rations below subsistence level. The military had priority for food, but even military rations had shrunk to dangerous lows. Meanwhile, American forces were planning the invasion of Japan with logistic support that included 500 Saozuzern tons of food stockpiled for initial assault forces, dedicated hospital ships with facilities exceeding many modern hospitals, portable ice cream plants to be established on captured beaches, water purification capacity to provide 10 gallons per soldier daily, bakeries capable of producing fresh bread for millions of troops, coffee supplies sufficient for 100 million cups weekly, refrigerated storage for 100,000 tons of frozen provisions. The invasion never happened. Atomic bombs and Soviet entry ended the war first. But the logistics planning revealed American assumptions about warfare, that soldiers should be well fed, well supplied, and well cared for because the industrial base could afford it, not as luxury, but as baseline expectation. Japanese forces planning final resistance were calculating how many days they could fight on stored rice, how to ration ammunition for maximum effect, whether soldiers could sustain combat on 1,000 calories daily. The two sides weren't just fighting different wars. They inhabited different material realities. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he cited a new and most cruel bomb as justification. But many Japanese soldiers and sailors understood the real reason. The atomic bombs were devastating, yes, but they were symptoms of the larger disparity. America could afford to spend billions developing atomic weapons while simultaneously maintaining conventional warfare at global scale. Japan couldn't afford adequate rice rations. Former prisoners watched the surrender announcement with complex emotions. Relief that the killing would end. Shame at national defeat. But also grim satisfaction that their observations about American abundance, reports that had been dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration, were finally, tragically vindicated. Lieutenant Ogawa, who discovered ice cream machines aboard the Lexington in October 1944, was held at a POW facility in Hawaii when the war ended. He later wrote, "I felt no surprise at the surrender announcement, only surprise that we'd lasted so long after the outcome became mathematically certain. Courage and spirit cannot defeat industrial production. Willingness to die cannot overcome abundance of resources." These should have been obvious truths from the start. America won the war in 1941 when their industrial mobilization began. Everything afterward was just the inevitable conclusion of economic laws playing out through military action. We fought bravely, skillfully, desperately. It didn't matter. You cannot sink ships faster than they're built, shoot down aircraft faster than they're manufactured, or kill soldiers faster than they're trained and equipped, not when the enemy outproduces you 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. The ice cream was always the perfect symbol. A nation that could afford frozen desserts on warships during total war possessed resources we couldn't comprehend. We should have surrendered when the ice cream machines arrived. Everything after that was just delayed acceptance of mathematical reality. After the war, American interrogators compiled extensive testimonies from Japanese prisoners, examining how these men, among Japan's finest pilots and sailors, came to understand their defeat. The consistent theme wasn't tactical failure or inadequate courage. It was economic inevitability discovered through abundance's physical evidence. One of the most detailed post-war analyses came from Lieutenant Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who'd led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived to see Tokyo's surrender. His 1948 essay titled Logistics and Defeat synthesized interviews with hundreds of former Imperial Navy personnel. We began the war believing Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. We ended the war understanding that American materialism was itself a form of spirit, the spirit of industrial civilization mobilized for total war. The mistake wasn't strategic or tactical. The mistake was philosophical. We believed war was primarily about courage, skill, and will to fight. Americans understood war was about production capacity, logistics infrastructure, and ability to sustain operations indefinitely. They were correct. When our prisoners reported American ships had ice cream machines, we dismissed this as propaganda designed to demoralize us. When they reported Americans ate fresh meat daily, we assumed exaggeration. When they described waste on scales exceeding our production, we thought they were lying or breaking under interrogation pressure. They weren't lying. They were observing accurately and trying to warn us that we were fighting an unwinnable war. We didn't listen because accepting their observations required abandoning fundamental assumptions about warfare and national character. The ice cream machines represented something we couldn't conceptualize, an industrial base so vast that luxury production during total war was trivial. We thought making ice cream on warships was decadent waste. Americans thought it was good personnel management. Well-fed, contented sailors worked harder and fought better, and the cost was negligible relative to total production capacity. Both perspectives were internally consistent, but only one reflected actual material conditions. American sailors expecting ice cream aboard carriers wasn't soft or weak. It was realistic assessment of what their civilization could provide. Japanese sailors accepting rice and pickled radish as normal wasn't strong or disciplined. It was adaptation to scarcity that better logistics would have prevented. We confused imposed scarcity with chosen discipline. We thought suffering improved soldiers. Americans understood that suffering impaired performance and should be minimized through adequate supply. Their approach won because it was based on industrial reality rather than philosophical preference. The final proof came in prisoner treatment. Japanese military doctrine held that capture was dishonorable, that soldiers should die rather than surrender. This doctrine existed partly because we couldn't afford to feed prisoners adequately. We barely fed our own forces. Americans fed prisoners generously because they could easily afford it, and because international law and simple humanity required it. Their generosity to prisoners wasn't weakness, it was strength. They could afford to be humane because their abundance made humanity cheap. We couldn't afford humanity because our scarcity made cruelty necessary. This difference between a military sustained by abundance and a military constrained by scarcity explains the war's outcome more completely than any tactical analysis. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, Navy minister during much of the war, provided even more damning assessment in his 1952 memoir. We knew America's industrial capacity exceeded ours substantially. We didn't understand the ratio. We estimated perhaps 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 in critical materials. The actual ratios were often 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. This miscalculation was fatal, but even accurate numbers might not have prevented war. Japanese strategic culture in 1941 assumed that American resolve would break under casualties, that their materialistic society couldn't sustain prolonged conflict, that our warrior spirit would overcome their industrial might. These assumptions were completely wrong, based on fundamental misunderstanding of American character and industrial civilization's capacity for total war. The ice cream issue became symbolic post-war of our miscalculation. When former prisoners testified about American carriers serving frozen desserts routinely, Many Japanese officers initially refused to believe them. The idea seemed preposterous. Why waste resources on luxuries during war? But Americans weren't wasting resources. They were investing in morale, crew efficiency, and combat effectiveness through means their economy could easily support. The cost was trivial. The benefit, maintaining high morale on extended combat deployments, was substantial. The calculation made perfect sense from their perspective. We failed to understand that American military culture wasn't separate from American industrial culture. It was an expression of it. Their military reflected their society's abundance, efficiency, and pragmatic approach to resource allocation. Our military reflected our society's scarcity, hierarchy, and spiritual approach to sacrifice. When these two systems collided, the outcome was predetermined by economic fundamentals we'd miscalculated. You cannot defeat abundance with scarcity, regardless of courage or skill. We learned this lesson at immense cost. The ice cream should have taught us earlier. Perhaps the most poignant post-war testimony came from Ensign Sakamoto Hideo, who'd survived Yamato's final sortie. I spent 6 months in American prisoner of war camps before repatriation. The food in those camps, meant for prisoners, not soldiers, exceeded what I'd eaten aboard Japanese warships. We received 3 meals daily, adequate portions, occasional fresh fruit, coffee, even sweets sometimes. American guards explained that Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, adequate nutrition, medical care. The regulations existed because America could afford to follow them. Japan had signed the same conventions but couldn't afford compliance. Our prisoners received whatever we could spare, which was almost nothing because we were starving ourselves. The American guards weren't cruel, but they weren't particularly sympathetic either. They were just doing their jobs, following regulations, treating prisoners the way their system required. And their system could require humane treatment, because abundance made it affordable. One guard, when I expressed surprise at the food quality, said something I've never forgotten. War's about winning, not suffering. Why would we want you suffering? You're not dangerous anymore. You're just hungry guys who need feeding until you can go home. That perspective, that defeated enemies were just hungry guys requiring temporary feeding, reflected abundance so vast that supporting thousands of prisoners was bureaucratic routine rather than logistical crisis. We couldn't feed our own forces adequately. They fed prisoners casually and expected no credit for basic humanity. When I returned to Japan in 1946, I found a nation starving. American occupation forces were distributing food aid to prevent mass starvation. The same military that had destroyed us was now feeding us because we couldn't feed ourselves. The same ships that had bombarded our cities were now delivering rice because our infrastructure had collapsed. I watched Japanese civilians line up for American food distributions and remembered the ice cream aboard USS Lexington. The connection was clear. A nation that could afford ice cream on warships during war could easily afford rice for defeated enemies during peace. Abundance made generosity cheap. Scarcity made cruelty necessary. We'd fought against this abundance for 4 years, believing spirit would overcome material. We'd been wrong. The ice cream proved it. Everything afterward was just accepting the proof. The story of Japanese pilots discovering ice cream machines aboard American carriers became, in post-war years, a shorthand for understanding the Pacific War's fundamental dynamics. It wasn't the most important factor. Strategy, tactics, technology, and leadership all mattered. But the ice cream symbolized something crucial, that America fought World War II not from scarcity, but from abundance. And that abundance was itself a war-winning advantage. The statistics are now historical record. America outproduced Japan by factors of 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 in critical materials. American shipyards built vessels faster than combat could sink them. American factories produced aircraft in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. American farms fed military and civilian populations while supplying allies globally. The numbers are indisputable, but numbers alone don't capture the psychological impact of discovering, as Japanese prisoners did, that the enemy you'd been taught to despise as weak and decadent was actually strong precisely because of its industrial abundance. That the soft Americans who wanted ice cream and hot showers and fresh bread were militarily superior because their economy could provide these comforts while simultaneously supporting global warfare. Vice Admiral Kusaka Ryunosuke, who'd served as Chief of Staff for the First Air Fleet at Pearl Harbor and survived the war, perhaps put it best in his 1963 reflection. We attacked Pearl Harbor believing we could defeat America before their industrial might fully mobilized. We were wrong about the timing. They mobilized faster than we predicted. But we were more fundamentally wrong about what their industrial might meant. We thought industrial strength was about building weapons. It is, but it's also about building everything else: infrastructure, logistics, living standards, margins of safety. American military strength wasn't separate from American civilian prosperity. It emerged from the same industrial base, the same resource abundance, the same economic system. The ice cream machines weren't waste or decadence. They were symptoms of an economic system so productive that it could afford luxuries while fighting total war. Our refusal to believe this, our insistence that suffering and sacrifice were necessary virtues rather than the symptoms of inadequate logistics, cost us the war and millions of lives. If I could travel back to December 1941 and speak to my younger self, I wouldn't discuss tactics or strategy. I would simply say, they have ice cream machines on their carriers. We do not. This difference is insurmountable. Accept it and find another path. Everything important about the war's outcome was contained in that simple observation. Lieutenant Ogawa, who'd first discovered the ice cream aboard USS Lexington in October 1944, survived the war and lived until 1989. In his final interview, conducted in 1987, he was asked what he remembered most vividly from his wartime service. Not the combat, though I flew over 50 missions. Not the fear, though I was terrified many times. Not even the shame of capture, though that haunted me for years. What I remember most clearly was the ice cream. I can still see the machine in that carrier's galley, churning away, producing vanilla ice cream for men who expected such luxuries even at war. I can still taste the ice cream they served me, the first frozen dessert I'd had in over a year, given to me by enemies I'd been trying to kill hours before. That ice cream taught me something universities and military training never did. That war isn't primarily about courage or tactics or technology. It's about capacity. The capacity to sustain operations, maintain forces, absorb losses, and continue fighting regardless of setbacks. America had that capacity. Japan did not. The ice cream proved it. Every generation should learn this lesson, though I hope they learn it without war. Industrial capacity matters. Economic strength matters. The ability to provide for your people, whether sailors or civilians, matters more than abstract notions of warrior spirit or national character. We believed sacrifice made us strong. It made us hungry. They believed abundance made them soft. It made them victorious. These were the only lessons that mattered, and we learned them too late. The ice cream machines were removed from American carriers years ago. Modern ships have different food service systems, different priorities, different constraints. But the principle remains. Military forces sustained by industrial abundance fight differently than forces constrained by scarcity. They can afford patience over desperation, care over waste, humanity over cruelty, not because they're morally superior, but because their economy makes such choices affordable. Japan learned this lesson at immeasurable cost. The ice cream machines were always just ice cream machines. But they were also proof that Japan was fighting an unwinnable war against an economy that could afford luxuries during total war. That truth, discovered by pilots pulled from the Pacific and served ice cream by their captors, remained true regardless of courage, skill, or sacrifice. The Pacific War ended 78 years ago. The carriers that served ice cream have long since been scrapped. The pilots who discovered those machines are nearly all gone, but the lesson endures. In modern warfare, logistics is destiny, abundance is strength, and industrial capacity determines outcomes more completely than warrior spirit ever can. American sailors expected ice cream because their civilization could provide it. Japanese pilots went hungry because theirs could not. And that difference, more than any battle or strategy or technological innovation, explained why one nation won and the other lost. The ice cream machines were never just about ice cream. They were about everything. If this story opened your eyes to how wars are really won, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me which fact shocked you most. And subscribe, because next week's story is even more mind-blowing. See you in the next one.